So in the last lesson, we looked at adaptation. Basically, adaptation is something that the organism gets or has that gives it an advantage within its particular habitat. And we kind of looked at just some examples of, for example, the different plants and animal adaptations and the benefits that they gave, let's say, within their particular environment. Now, what I want to look at next then is, so when we move on then to step 8 in relation to the study of a habitat, so step 8. What we're looking at in step 8 is competition. So it's competition. And this is really like competition between species and within species as well. Okay, so what is competition? So we look at the definition, and again, you need to know these definitions. So competition is the interaction between members of the same species So members of the same species will be, for example, like a species are organisms that can actually breed with each other. So, for example, squirrels would be a particular species of squirrels. So there's a particular species, and they can actually breed with each other. Or it can be between. So competition is the interaction between members of the same species. So, for example, between the squirrel population, there might be different types of squirrels. For example, red squirrels and brown squirrels, or grey squirrels. And you also have, so it's interaction between members of the same species or members of different species. And they're interacting, and what they're doing is they're actually competing for resources. So for resources that are in short or limited supply. So this is the idea of competition. And again, this is within step 8 of our study of a habitat. We want to look at, is there any kind of competition between organisms? So again, so competition is the interaction between members of the same species or members of different species for resources that are in short or limited supply. So for example, you can get plants that are competing for light, water, and space. So for example, plants compete. So they're going to compete for light, water, and physical space. So you may get some trees, for example. So you might have trees that will have, like, let's say, really big canopies like so. And what they're trying to do is, so they're going to outcompete anything that's on the ground, for example, like anything that's underneath its shade like that, they're going to outcompete. So they're going to have these big like canopies, for example, and they may even grow taller as well, so that they're getting more of the sun. Also as well, they might have really big, elaborate, complicated root structures that enable it to, gather up resources from the ground as well. But they're going to compete. They're going to compete with other plants or other trees around it to get that space. That's why they're going to grow. They're going to try and grow taller than their rivals, for example, because they want to get they want to get all of the sun, and they also want to get the resources like water and things from the ground. So you get animals then as well. So animals are also going to compete as well with each other. And what are animals going to compete for? They're going to compete for food, shelter, so food, shelter. They'll also compete for mates, and they'll also compete for territory as well. So there'll be limited amounts. So let's say within a particular habitat, there's going to be limited supplies of food and shelter and mates and just the general territory as well. So what you're going to have is you're going to get animals like competing with each other for those limited resources. And a really good example of this competition as well is between these two guys here as well. So a good example of competition between different species in Ireland is the competition between the red, so this guy here, the red squirrel, and this guy here, which is the grey squirrel. So this guy here is actually native to Ireland, and this guy was imported. So the red squirrel is a native species found in Ireland since the late Ice Age. So this guy has been around for a long time in Ireland. So the grey squirrel was introduced in 1911 to County Longford, so that's not too far away from where we are. The grey squirrel has moved into the territory of the red squirrel and now competes with it for food. So for example, you can see that this guy, he's much bigger and stronger, he's much bigger than this guy. So when he comes into this guy's territory, he starts to consume and he's able to get the food and he starts to outcompete this red squirrel. Although there is no great aggression between these two species, so it's not like they're having a battle with each other. The grey squirrel is bigger and stronger than the red squirrel and is generally the winner. So this guy will actually get to resources quicker and faster than this fellow will. So what happens is when these grey squirrels kind of come into an area, the red squirrels usually disappear from woodland areas within 20 years of the appearance of the grey squirrel. So again, this guy just comes in and he outcompetes the red squirrel for resources, shelter, and just space, for example, within the particular territory as well. So that's an example of competition in relation to how particular organisms, they compete with, in this case, organisms within the same species for limited resources within an environment. So again, just to kind of recap on what we looked at in this lesson. So step 8 then in the habitat study is we look at competition. And competition is the interaction between members of the same species or members of different species for resources that are in short or limited supply. So for example, plants are going to compete with each other for things like light, water and space. So they might actually physically grow bigger than other plants, or they might have bigger canopies, for example, so they can take up more of the sun, or they might have bigger, more complicated root structures that enable them to get to the limited resources in the habitat before other organisms can. Animals then also, they compete for food, mates, shelter and territory, and we looked at the example of the grey squirrel and the red squirrel in Ireland as well. So that's like an example of competition. So, and it happens all the time. Humans as well compete for resources. Countries, for example, they compete and fight wars over limited resources such as oil and other fossil fuels as well. So it's something that kind of goes on. Resources are limited, and as a result of that, this happens. Competition happens in nature. So hopefully that makes sense, and thank you for listening.